Class, we're privileged today to be meeting with Colonel Gent Welsh with the Washington National Guard, whose responsibility is the cybersecurity function for the Washington National Guard. We're going to be talking to him about his position, about how he manages cybersecurity in this responsibility, and he'll have some pointers for you as you think about your own career development. So, Gent, maybe you can give us an idea of who you are, your specific title, what you actually do here, and your responsibilities.
You bet. Certainly welcome. Thanks for tuning in. Colonel Gent Welsh. I've been the Chief of Staff down here at the Military Department for about 3 years. Pretty varied career in the military, about 29 years total. So how I started out as a security policeman. So started out something totally different than cyber. And basically grew up through the traditional IT communications communities within the National Guard and the Air Force, and really only became involved in what we now call cyber activities for probably about the last 6 years. Previously, I was the Chief Information Officer for the Military Department and the National Guard here. Very involved in cyber from how does the National Guard protect our critical infrastructure in our state and our country. And really have spent a lot of my recent time spending on really cyber policy issues. I'd really call it that. What's the Guard's role within the state for cyber? How do we outreach for critical infrastructure security? And really working with you and working with some of your students in the past on some internships. But really kind of looking at what is cyber and what do we look at as a country moving forward.
So if the students were curious about the stepping stones along the way that got you to where you are today, how would you describe the key things that you did that prepared you? Starting out as a policeman is interesting. I've met a number of people that got their start in cybersecurity exactly from that position, physical security, those sorts of things. So what along the way guided you or prepared you to take this responsibility?
Well, I think just, certainly from a military perspective, it's basic leadership. So I am a non-technical guy. So I have an English degree.
I do too, but I don't tell a lot of people.
That is my degree. A non-technical person, you're not going to find any abbreviations after my name, CISSP or anything like that. So from my standpoint, I've spent most of my time in really the management of the policy aspects of cyber, leading others, developing others. But from how do you get from here to there? I think you kind of have to make some choices. Are you going to be really in the technical realm? Are you going to be in the policy realm? Are you going to be in the management realm? Can you do all three? I'm not sure. We've got some great managers that have absolutely no technical skills, and that would be me. We've got great technical folks that aren't very good managers or policy folks. So you've got to figure out what sort of lane that you want to travel in from a cybersecurity standpoint. I recommend the policy angle. I think that's the most interesting, but that's what my sort of story is there.
How about training along the way, Jen? You got into IT. How did that happen from your initial position?
So from an IT perspective, I was what they call a combat communications squadron commander. So basically, in my role, I had a unit of about 130 folks, and what our job was to deploy anywhere in the world and set up the normal communication systems that you'd find on any base that we've got in the country here. So from just kind of a take your network on the road kind of guy, that was my background. How I got into cyber was basically, as I moved up in my career, we started converting, communications folks to cyber folks and started working at network defense type missions, and that's really kind of how I got into the position I'm in now. So a lot of it started from really my experience as a leader and as a commander, and then kind of moved into my role as a CIO, and really spent my time again in the policy areas and not so much the technology, development.
Although you say you're not a technical person, my guess is you probably do have technical knowledge.
Just enough to be dangerous. That's about it. But like anything in leadership, surround yourself with good folks, and you're only as good as the folks that work with you. So they've carried me for a lot of years technically, but I'm not going to be the one that's going in there and reconfiguring firewalls and configuring applications and writing script. to do different things, but I can certainly lead them in the direction that we need to head.
Does leadership include understanding who to listen to and who not? I'm asking because on the technical side, I found that it's important to know who's grounded and who isn't.
It does. I think, like anything, I mean, there's always noise, wherever you're at. I mean, there's always opinions of do it this way or do it that way. My general approach is always sort of, take the high and the low, sort of extremes and toss those off. And where's kind of the middle, the middle voice. Certainly in cyber, there's a lot of, cyber is really undefined. I think sort of like I was using an example with someone earlier today, it's like saying, how do you deal with children? Well, what do you mean? Do you deal with this piece or that piece or whatever in daycare? Well, what's cyber? What cyber to you is different than what cyber means to me. It's in some ways an overused term. Mm-hmm. So I think with cyber, it's like saying, the fish is this big. Well, okay, what part are you really talking about? Are you talking about network security? You're talking about training? Are you talking about offensive cyber warfare? What part of cyber, is really the question. So that's part of the issue right now is just cyber is probably an overused term.
So getting to what you actually do and what your responsibilities are, the students have been looking at a standard model for organizational cybersecurity that begins with mission and goals of the organization, understanding that in the context of risk, and then developing policy based on where your risks are, and then identifying controls, procedural controls and technical controls, doing the awareness training, and then having repeated audits so that you continually update your risk profile. So they understand cybersecurity from that perspective. How's it different in the military? What are your responsibilities and how do you organize that?
So I would say that model is very familiar to the model that we use in the military for a lot of our operations, and we actually call that what's called an OODA loop. So observe, orient, decide, and act. So it's very much a sort of in a Stephen Covey way, seek first, understand, and then be understood. So you got to understand what the problem is. You got to figure that piece out a little bit. You got to have some collaborative approaches on fixing it. You got to implement those pieces. Then you got to decide if they're working. And by the time that you've rolled through that loop, the threat or the challenge has probably evolved, that much further, and that's why the loop continues to repeat. So our challenges in the military are really severalfold. One. Not only do we have the responsibility of securing our own networks, and we were discussing that earlier about how in many cases the military networks are not even secured locally. So on this base, for instance, we've got very few network folks that are actually working on our network. All those folks are actually at a higher level. So in many cases, we've got our systems configured in such a way that they're only managed at several places. So what that does is it reduces the attack surface and risk surface. If you have less system administrators, you have less guys like Snowden, sort of employed to sort of take care of your things. So you sort of reduce the risk that way. But we've got our own network responsibilities, but we also have to, not only protect our own systems, but protect other systems within DoD that may not even understand what's going on within their systems. So I'll give you an example, our air defense systems, so our radars that show us where airplanes are flying, across the country. That's got, a number of security concerns that we've looked at over the years. There's some great, video from a 60 Minutes story a couple of years back of some of the work that we've done securing our intercontinental ballistic missiles across the country. So, those are the kind of things. It's not only what you're doing for the network that we have to train on. It's how do we take that knowledge and then, better secure the country.
And how do you organize within the Washington state region that you're responsible for? So
basically the National Guard, certainly Washington is what I would call geographically blessed. So we actually have a cyber, and I talked about cyber and overused, but a cyber operations group. So it's about 500 airmen. It's a little bit more if you include some of the Army, National Guard folks, but say 500-600 folks within the Washington National Guard are involved in some type of cyber activity. And they just organize like any other military unit, so within company structures or squadron structures, but that unit has a defined mission to do something within the Department of Defense. It's either to protect our networks, to help protect others' networks, potentially to project power, cyber power, across the country and the globe. So that's kind of how we organize, just very traditional military.
So you're not really concerned necessarily about your own internal operational networks so much. You're looking at cybersecurity in a strategic sense.
Yeah, very much concerned about, and not that we're not concerned about our own security, I think we are, but just the way that DoD networks are configured, it's basically a lot of enterprise management. So you don't have, like if you're in the corporate world, you're responsible for your piece. You're not worried about your neighbor, Starbucks down the road. You're just worried about your piece. We have folks that are worried about our networks, but we're more worried about the safety of a lot of our control systems, a lot of our critical functions that we do in the military. Even with the recent news about the ability of TVs to be hacked and everything else, we're worried about, again, folks potentially doing that type of stuff against us.
I wondered about that role that you play in the state of Washington, because it's a little different from what we think of traditional military units doing. You've got a civilian concern. So how does that play out for the Guard in terms of what you are concerned about?
Right. So from a Guard perspective, we in some ways tend to look at cyber as, and I don't want to sort of discount it by saying it's just any other threat, but if you look at the cyber threat alongside, the threat that we have from, floods, fires, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis. I mean, this is the potpourri of disaster, risk state. So if you look at cyber from a risk perspective and you sort of put it in lanes that we've already established. So from an emergency management perspective, we have good processes for working with civilians, for working with the civilian community. And in fact, that's the hallmark of the Guard. We, sort of neighbors helping neighbors. We exist to help others. And when we do help, we're not in charge in many cases. If we're filling sandbags for a county, we're working for that county, commission or that mayor, in support of whatever they've got. Same in cyber. If there is something that happens of significance that happens in the state that causes us to basically have to respond, and it's always in response to a request. We don't just say, hey, we're going to go help you. We're not from the government and we're here to help. We wait to be asked. But when we do respond, I mean, it's very much with as much capabilities as we can, and it's in support of whatever that organization is that needs help. And it's not just, I'll just sort of use the Starbucks example, the coffee, machine isn't working and that's connected to this network. Not so much concerned with that, even though some would consider that critical infrastructure in the state.
Yes.
More concerned about the power companies, the water companies, the transportation networks, things that when they are compromised cause physical consequences, and that's really the big place that we're at now, between the convergence of cyber and somebody hacking and stealing data, and Elvis left the building 6 months ago, to the point where a cyber actor is physically controlling your network and keeping you out of it. And then those consequences are having physical manifestations. Either the water stops flowing, or Mike Hamilton would say your toilet flushes backwards, or the power's not on. Because when those things happen, just like any other physical consequence, they have second, third order effects. The power's not out. People are not getting the services that they're used to. Hospital lights aren't on. And then in some cases, you've got some public disorder, potential concerns after a long extended outage.
So this is something I wanted to bring out for our students, Jen, because you not only have your role here in the state of Washington, but you've had a national leadership role in developing cyber response to a major event. And as I've gone around the country, people know about this unit. They know about you folks. They know about you and what you've done. And as the Guard reconciles itself to protecting the homeland from external agents that might do us harm over our networks, we've been a pioneering state. And so could you speak a little bit about how you've conceptualized and contributed to thought along those lines?
So I think there's that sort of famous saying, and I've used it a number of times, that all it takes for bad things to continue is for good people to do nothing. So I think that's sort of an approach that folks have to look at is, do we wait for the federal discussion to solve itself and wait to be told, or do you recognize that at whatever level that you're operating at, what some of the right things to do are, and just move out? I mean, that's, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, as some say. So I think in our case in the state, we had some great capabilities within the National Guard. We saw a need for some capability out there, so there's even today, there still exists a huge gap between, let's say, Puget Sound Energy. If something happens to Puget Sound Energy tonight that causes, almost like Sony, causes something very catastrophic to happen, and they pretty soon run out of, resources or knowledge or whatever to help, who helps them, and how does that help go? And then how does that help get requested within the state? What are some of the help mechanisms from the federal government? How does all that stuff work? And that's, you just got to, like anything else, figure out where the gaps are. There's always gaps in any organization, and figure out what needs to be done and push it and sell it. And if you're doing the right thing for the right reasons, you're going to get plenty of support.
Well,
and that's kind of what we've done here.
You've sort of made the comment that we're lucky geographically, and I guess that's our location with Microsoft and Amazon in our backyard, and we draw from guard from those sources. So,
well, I would just say on that, I mean, I had sort of used the term we're geographically blessed. So what that means is a lot of people call themselves a center of excellence. Where just by proximity they've got all the like toys in the same toy box. For the most part, we've got all that here, but we all get along. I mean, where else do you find the military and the academic world, the private sector world, the rest of government, all working together, in a common way, and not sort of fighting with each other on whatever the issue is.
yes.
So this is really a common recognition that in some ways cyber, you could take it all the way from, well, it's an irritant, to in some ways it's an existential issue for the country because of our reliance on technology. I mean, if you look at any of the maps across the world of, what goes through the U.S. and all the lights on, everything else, and when you start taking those things away, you've really started impacting in many ways our very core and our own lifestyle, and cyber is the thread that permeates a lot of that. And, it's kind of like the airplane. When the airplane was first invented, it was actually used by the military to observe, troops. Nobody ever thought that the airplane would be used to shoot at, somebody or drop bombs, and it was through evolution that we kind of figured out that, well, hey, this actually is a platform that can be weaponized. It's not just for good purposes anymore, so as the airplanes used to go by each other in the First World War and the pilots would wave as they went and looked at the other side, pretty soon they started shooting at each other with pistols and then machine guns and then dropping bombs. Well, I think we're at the same place in cyber where, the internet was a great thing until somebody decided that could be a weapon, and then our over-reliance on technology could be used against us.
So
and that's really kind of where we're at.
That gets to something I wanted to discuss with you about the threat actors that we're facing and where you see the biggest threats coming at us. Who are you worried about today? Those sorts of concerns.
Well, certainly in cyber, I mean, if you study a lot of, I would call it military deterrence, not that, it's sort of like, deterrence in the Cold War where you've got a nuclear weapon and I've got a nuclear weapon and I don't want to shoot at you and you don't want to shoot at me because we both realize what damage that's going to cause. I think the greatest threat are people that have absolutely no care in the world that their actions will cause consequences for others, so some people worry about, nation states, the typical ones that come to mind, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. I think that there's always threats, I mean, that's just the natural order of international relations as countries are always, trying to figure out what somebody else is up to. But I worry about the person, and this is, your typical, almost even a terrorist, that just doesn't care, about what they do. And they've got nothing that you can hold at risk on their end. They've got everything to gain and nothing to lose. And especially in cyber, where the cost of entry is basically an internet connection. you don't have to spend a lot of money to develop a bunch of weapons. I mean, WikiLeaks is tossing all the CIA stuff out there, probably today. But the cost of entry is very low and the effects are very high, and I worry about that one, it's sort of that old thing back in the Cold War. I don't worry about the country that, has 100 nukes. I worry about the country that has one, and I worry about, the cyber actor, terrorist, activist, whatever that, goes from stealing things to post stuff online to actually holding some of this population at risk. I mean, we've gone from the days of, and we talked about this earlier, where the front lines, as we've always known them throughout conflict, have always been over there or somewhere else. Static lines on a map. Our battlefield is here at home. Our battlefield is at the front line of every corporate network. Every provider of critical infrastructure, every power company. So that's where this threat is, and that's why it really kind of requires a very collective approach with all of us to kind of get there. Defending the country in some ways isn't just a military problem anymore.
So what kind of controls would you see effective in that kind of a scenario or environment that you've described? How do you cope with that threat environment?
Flush your phone down the toilet and unplug. It's hard. I think it's a balance that, like in any information technology enterprise, you've got to realize that you can't keep building higher walls. I think that the standard network defense is, well, I'm just going to put more sensors out there and I'm going to try and detect the bad guys. Well, in many cases, the bad guy's already in your network. And the bad actor is already waiting at some point for something to happen that's going to cause them to activate whatever their malicious code is and kind of hold your network hostage. So what do you do? I think, again, it's just got to be a balance between figuring out what's important in your network and your company and the organization that, as a network cyber professional, you're kind of charged to protect and create policy for, and really cost, and that's just the balance. But really the challenge is, in many cases, from a network security perspective, companies don't even understand their own networks. They don't even understand the risks. They don't even, in many cases, understand what their most important processes are. And that's the case, and that's the challenge as a cyber professional is you've got to get in and understand the operational needs of your organization. You're just not a support actor anymore. You're just not somebody that's sort of just kind of keeping the printers running and everything else. You're a very integral part of the business of that company, because everybody is on the net. Everybody's dependent on that.
So if our students are interested in careers in this space, what would you suggest they look at? What are the opportunities in the military, for example?
Well, tremendous opportunities in the military. I think, I'll speak for sort of two parts of that. I mean, from an active duty perspective where you're doing this every day, there's great opportunities. But in many cases, we lose a lot of folks because the pay is not competitive. They love what they're doing, they love wearing the uniform, but they just can't quite get there, from a paycheck standpoint. And what's unique about the Guard is you can have, as our friend Tom Muehlheisen would say, you can have cake and pie. You don't have to choose. You can actually serve your country and do some really cool stuff on the weekend. And in some cases, like I've always said, our folks sometimes get to shoot back. And shooting back if you're in a company may be illegal. But in many ways, shooting back as a military member is not. So that's kind of a draw. But the other is you can still have your civilian career. You can go get your education. You can come in the Guard. You can get some great training, some great experience. And basically, one of the great things about the Guard is it's built-in networking. So you already are surrounding yourself in an organization with a bunch of other professionals that work in this industry that have all the contacts. I can't tell you how many people come in the Guard that have absolutely no idea what they want to do, and they go into a cyber or IT career field, get all the military training, and serve 1 week in a month, and then through the contacts that they make in their unit, are now working for more money than I'll even dream of making at companies like Microsoft and Amazon and others. And that's just what's unique about the Guard is you can have the cake and the pie.
I've heard students from the military talk about all the cool things they get to do, and it certainly is an attraction for people to go into the military. So if you had students that might be interested in pursuing a career like that, how would you advise them? What are the things they should do? How do you go about getting that first step?
In the military side?
Sure.
The key thing is just understand that, first and foremost, it's a military organization, and so since it's a military organization, you've got to, complete your school. You've got to stay in reasonably decent shape. You've got to, even in this state, as tough as it is to say, remain drug-free, and that's a challenge for us. So if you look at, the recruiting issues that the military has, and particularly the National Guard, is finding somebody that's even qualified for military standards is a huge lift. And then, and part of it is staying out of trouble. You've got, because in many of these cyber career fields, you have a top secret clearance. And a top secret clearance means that you can't have law enforcement trouble. You've got to have neighbors that say good things about you. You've got to have a clean record. And that's tougher and tougher and tougher, these days. But anyways, you got to be qualified in the military, and then you've got to basically have the aptitude to go into one of these career fields. And they're not easy. I mean, some of these career fields are tough to get through. Some of the training is very tough. Because again, they're not necessarily teaching you how to just kind of work in a company and you kind of figure it out. There's a national security imperative, to our jobs. So if you're not quite doing it, there's probably another place for you. So it's tough, but if you make it through, you're in a pretty good position.
Is there anything we haven't covered? Is there any last admonition or recommendation you'd make to people studying this subject now? Any last thoughts?
The only thing I'd say is just certainly I think there's the old Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times, and I think we're absolutely living in interesting times. And to take that a step further, may you work in an interesting career. You're absolutely working in an interesting career. And it's a career that is really like no other, because I don't know how this is going to continue to evolve. And that's one thing, that change is always going to be constant in this area. And you're really, kind of writing history as you go. So it's kind of back to, in 50 years, you look back, did you do something meaningful? Did you have an impact? And certainly in cybersecurity, and certainly from a military perspective, you're having that impact. A lot of our career fields train and train and train for years, and they never get to do anything. Well, in the cyber world, I mean, you're doing something every day. I mean, it's the daily, some would say daily battle, but you're making a difference every day, and I think that's what's important, whether you're in the military or not. So that's my piece.
Well, thank you, Gent. Thank you for your time.
You're certainly welcome.
And thank you for talking to our students.
You're welcome. Always a pleasure, Barbara.